to go. Okay, so modern biology. This is the second lesson that we'll be working on in modern biology. First lesson was recorded, I think, last Thursday, so this will be our second lesson. In the first lesson, we had an introduction to the study of the natural sciences and to biology. So you can go back and review those videos if you want all of those details. But I'll go through a brief introduction, again, a review of that introduction, and we'll talk about it a bit. So let's go through a quick introduction to modern biology. We said that in high school, we have 120 hours per year. 120 hours per year in high school science, multiplied by 4 years, gives us a total of 480 hours of natural science studies. 480 hours of natural science studies that make up a quality college preparatory high school science program. And we said that this high school science curriculum breaks down into 3 basic courses which are taught in every high school. The first of which is biology. The second is chemistry or physics. The order differs from one school to another. But those are the 3 main natural sciences that are taught in a modern high school science program. Okay, those are the 3 basic science courses, the subjects of scientific studies that are covered in high school. And then in a 4th year, you can pretty much study anything you want. Some kids go on to study advanced biology, advanced physics, advanced chemistry. But in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, what we recommend is the study of physiology. Physiology, especially human physiology, is the study of our body, all of the parts of our bodies, and the functions of those parts. Because as you would enter adulthood, you should know how your own bodies work. All right? So a solid college preparatory natural science program would look something like this: biology, physics, chemistry, and a 4th study in a subject like physiology. All right? In this course, obviously, we're studying biology. So in this first of the natural sciences, we're studying biology, and we said in our first video that biology means the science of life. The science of living things. The science of living things. That's what we mean by biology. In chemistry and physics, we don't necessarily study living things. But in biology, we're interested in the study of living things. Things that live, are living, or have lived. Because death and decay are part of life. Okay? So biology is the study of living things. And one thing that we studied in the first lesson that's extremely important, one of the things we studied in the first lesson is that scientific study in natural sciences, modern natural sciences, the knowledge of modern natural sciences are based on observation. What makes natural sciences modern natural sciences, what makes them different from classical natural philosophy, is that they are based entirely on observation. And this is an extremely important point. The problem with most modern sciences, with most modern science courses, with most modern science books, the problem is that they do not stick to this point. They don't stick to talking about things that can be observed. The minute that scientists start to talk about the origin of the world, there's no way to talk about the origin of the world by observation, right? There's no way to talk about that. We can't talk about the human soul by observation. We can't talk about spirits. We can't talk about angels or demons. We can't talk about God by observation, right? We can't talk about galaxies far, far away by observation. We can't talk about atoms even by observation. And one of the problems is that in modern science classes, in modern science videos, in modern science books, people who claim to be modern scientists will talk about many topics that cannot be observed. And when you think that men are often talking about these things to students who don't know, it's really not fair for scientists and teachers to talk about things in science classes to kids who don't know about things that can't be observed. You understand that? And so you as students, you have to be careful that when you sit in a science class or read a science textbook or watch a science video, you have to be careful and constantly ask yourself, is this information based on observation? Because if it's not based on observation, it's not true science. You understand that? The natural sciences are the study of sensible objects, things that can be observed. And if we can't observe them, then it's not science. It's just philosophy or religion or opinion. True science is the study of what can be observed. And as students, you have to make sure that you keep science textbooks and science videos and science teachers accountable to that. If it can't be observed, it's not natural science. Okay? Now, what is possible in science classes, in scientific studies, what is possible is for us to have theories. Okay? So we can have theories. A theory is something different. A theory is not scientific knowledge. A theory is an attempt to predict what's true. It's an attempt, we could say it's a guess at what's true. And making theories is a part of what's called the scientific method. Making theories, proposing theories, is a part of how we study the natural world through natural sciences. There's nothing wrong with theories. Theories can be proposed that appear to contradict ideas that we hold and assume to be true. For example, if I read the book of Genesis and I read about how God created the world and how God made this and God made this and God made this, and some scientist proposes a theory of evolution, there's nothing wrong with that as a theory. You understand that? You can propose any theory you want. You can propose that the planet Jupiter is made out of milk. You can propose that as a theory. If you had reason to believe that that was possibly true, you could propose that as a theory, and that's fine as a theory. That's where scientific experimentation and investigation, that's where it gets started. It gets started with a theory. But the point of a theory is to propose or suggest a solution that we're then all going to work to test by experiments and by observation to see if it's actually true. And if we can't observe what the theory proposes, it cannot be said to be true. It's only theory. And this is what's dangerous in modern science. There are many ideas in modern science that are theories, but what happens is scientists and teachers stop talking about them as theories, and they start to talk about them as if they're already proven facts. And as science students, you can't allow that to happen. You have to be careful to separate facts, which are based on observation in science, from theories, which are just suggested possible solutions to problems or questions. Okay? And you'll find in the study of science, you'll find if you ask questions and don't just accept everything, but if you ask questions, you'll find that much of the stuff that's talked about in science has never been observed. It's just theory, but the theory is no longer talked about as theory. It's talked about as if it's already proven, and it has never been proven. And that's one of the problems with modern sciences, is that there's too much theory presented as fact, and it ruins science. It makes many people distrust science or dislike science, and it's really not fair to science, because science really can't do anything wrong. It's just theories and experiments and observations. Science can't do anything wrong. The scientific method can't do anything wrong. It's that science is misused by people to actually teach philosophical ideas and teach religious ideas as if they're facts. And that's what's evil in modern science. So as long as we commit to sticking to this truth that scientific knowledge is based on observation, we'll be safe. And science can be very useful, very helpful. But the minute that we start talking about things that are theories as if they're facts, we're just using science as an excuse to hold ideas that we really don't have any proof for. And there are many examples of how men do that. Many men use science as an excuse to disobey Christianity and reject Christianity and pretend that science tells them or shows them that what Christianity teaches is false. And they have no proof. Right? To say, I don't believe God created the world, or I don't believe that God exists because man evolved from apes, that's a theory. That's a theory. That's why it used to be called evolutionary theory. But now people will talk about evolution as if it's been demonstrated and proven. And look, if evolution has been proven, then show us the proof. Where's the proof? When I ask for proof, I'm never given proof of evolution. And that's all we should ask. We should say, if you would like to call evolution fact rather than theory, show us the proof. If you'd like to say this or that is true about the universe, show us the proof. And if you can't show us the proof, well, then why are we talking about it as if it's fact rather than theory, especially as scientific fact? So in our first lesson, we studied this first paragraph, and I'll switch over to the textbook here. In our first lesson, we studied this first brief section about science and matter. We talked about how science deals with the observation of material things. And again, this is why We can't accept theories as facts or talk about things that aren't material. Science cannot prove that God exists or doesn't exist. Science has nothing to do with angels or demons or spirits or the soul of man or ideas. Science is about physical, material objects. Down in the second paragraph in your book, you'll see we have a definition of biology. So let's take a look at that. Biology. We have a definition of biology. This is on page 24 of the document. It says, biology is the science which treats of matter in a living state. Biology is the science which treats of matter in a living state. And the two subdivisions of biology are botany and zoology. And we talked about that in our first lesson. Biology is the science which treats of matter in a living state. Living matter. Biology is the study of living matter. And biology has two divisions, just to review again. Two divisions of biology. We have botany, which is the study of what? Remember? Botany is the study of plants. And zoology, which is the study of animals. The Greek word zoon means animal. We have zoology, the study, the science of animals. So there are two parts, two divisions of biology, botany and zoology. And in the next paragraph, we studied what I just discussed, that scientific knowledge is gained by exact observation and correct thinking, but correct thinking about material things, things that can be observed and knowledge that can be demonstrated, not just theories. And then the last thing we talked about in our first lesson was that true scientific study has to deal with observation and experimentation. That is, we need to go out and look at things ourselves. We need to see these things in the natural world. We can't gain scientific knowledge through books alone. We have to observe these objects in nature, and we called those objects that we observe specimens. A thing that we actually observe and study for the sake of gaining scientific knowledge is called a specimen. And that's what scientific study and scientific knowledge are about. So we need to combine book study with what we might call laboratory experimentation or field observation. And we'll try to do that as we go through this course. We'll do as much observation of specimens as we can as we study along. And the ability for different students to do that is going to vary based on where they are and what they have access to. We're kind of spoiled here since we've got just about everything that we can need right outside. So let's move on in our textbook. The next section, make sure you jot down an outline as we go along, just to keep a record of what we cover in our classes. And your notes are always the best evidence of your attendance in classes. The next topic that we're going to look at is the classification of facts observed. The classification of facts observed. And that's important because, as we saw in our math studies, we saw that science is knowledge properly classified. Not just lists or piles of information, but classified, organized knowledge. Organized, systematic knowledge. Let's just read through this section. The knowledge that we gain by observation is worth very little to us or to anyone else unless we use our brains to classify it, to organize it, and apply it. We must find out what different facts mean as related to one another. We have to classify, organize information. Things that we observe have to be classified. And I talked about how that's one of the dangers of science, because what we have to do is interpret the things that we study. We have to interpret the things that we observe. And our observations can be true, but our interpretation can be false. So just because we observe something and our observation is true, that doesn't mean that our interpretation of it is also true. Do you understand that? Okay? Just because you observe something doesn't mean your interpretation of it is true. And a good example of where we see this is in National Geographic videos. They'll show you some animals doing things out in the wild, right? Or they'll show you plants or something in a video, and then they will explain what's going on. They'll interpret what's going on. They'll tell you about what the animal is thinking. They'll tell you what the animal desires. They'll tell you what the animal's trying to do, or they'll tell you why the animal does it. That's interpretation. It's not wrong for us to do that. It's not wrong for us to work to interpret what we see, but our interpretation can be false. And we have to keep it separate. We have to keep separate what we observe and how we interpret what we observe. All right? And you'll see that in those videos and in books like that all the time. Why does the whale do this? Because the whale evolved and that's interpretation. The observation that the whale does this or that is an observation. That's fine. But the interpretation is debatable. And that's really the question. The interpretation is what's really interesting. That's what we really want to get into and debate and discuss. Okay, so classifying facts that we observed. Let's keep reading. Single isolated facts about the color, coats, or markings found on the coats of a kidney bean mean but little to us if we cannot correlate these observations with others and relate them to scientific truths or principles that we've already learned. A great many men working for long periods of time have gathered together a large number of single, isolated facts. That means all kinds of disconnected information. But they have correlated these facts. They've connected them. They've connected these observations to other ideas in science, and then have given to the world discoveries of worldwide importance. A careful boy or girl may, by his own painstaking work in science, find out some fact that is new, and in some small way make a discovery. It is one of the most interesting things about science work that it has in it the spirit of discovery. So what should motivate us in the study of science is we really don't know whether it's possible that we could discover something. And again, not because you might see something new. You might never see something that other men haven't seen. But your ability to interpret it, to think about it, and relate it to other scientific information may be new. And that may lead to a discovery or through some solution to a problem. You see that? So the interpretation, this idea of what it says correlation, relating what you observe to other things, to other scientific knowledge, making connections between observations and different principles or questions in science. That's where the discoveries take place. Not that people necessarily see new things, but they think of them in new ways. Okay? And that should motivate us in scientific studies because we really don't know. Many of the discoveries that have been known in history have been accidental. Someone was looking for something or seeking something, and they accidentally found something else, or they thought of one thing and that led them to think about something else, and they solved some great problem almost accidentally. All right? So we want classified knowledge. We have to work to not only observe the natural world, but also to think on it, reflect on it, and correlate it to other things that we've learned and know. Let's move on to the next section, morphology. This word morphology, the Greek morphe, means a shape or a figure. So you have this new vocabulary word, morphology. It is evident in order to understand the cause of the regular movements of a clock. If you want to understand how a clock works, and we're talking about a wall clock, not a digital clock, not a digital watch. We're talking about a clock with hands, a mechanical clock. If we want to understand how the clock works, it would be necessary to take the wheels apart and find out the structure of the different pieces composing the works to see how the parts are related to each other. So if we want to understand how a clock works, we have to look inside of it and see what the parts are doing and how the clock is actually made to work. In the study of biology, it is usually found best to begin with the study of the form and structure of the parts of an organism. So just like we would study the parts of a clock or of a car, we would take it apart, study the parts, learn each of the different parts' characteristics, and then try to reassemble it and understand how the whole thing works. The same is true in biology. When we look at animals and their bodies, plants and their parts, we need to study and examine the parts to understand how those parts work and how the whole plant as an organism or the whole animal as a living thing works. The study of the parts of an organism, is called morphology. Morphology is the study of the parts of an organism. Physiology. After we have discovered in the clock the form and structure of the different wheels. Notice what it says, the form and structure. The form and structure. That's morphology. Morphology is the study of the form and the structure. After we have studied the form and structure of all the different parts, the wheels and the cogs, and the relation of one to the other, we're in a position to put them together again and find out how they move and what causes the movement, to study the use or function of each part. So this is what physiology is, the study of the movement, the study of the function of the different parts. The study of the uses and functions of the parts of an organism is called physiology. So these two different parts of this study. So if we go out into the natural world to observe natural things, we want to study plants, insects, animals, and so on, our study consists of two different things. First, we want to simply observe the parts of their bodies. We want to learn of their different parts, to be able to describe the different parts. That's morphology, the study of their form. And once we have an understanding of their parts, then we want to study to understand how their parts function. So if we were to take the human body, for example, and we were to open up your body and look inside your body, we'd see all kinds of parts, right? We'd see a heart, we'd see lungs, we'd see a stomach, we'd see intestines. We'd see all these different parts inside your body, and we could describe all of those parts. We could describe what the heart looks like. We could cut it open and look inside of it and see how the heart is composed. We can take all of the parts apart and look at them and study them, draw pictures, take pictures, describe them, and we can learn about all the parts. But that wouldn't be enough. We'd also have to learn and study what those parts do. And to this day, there are parts of our bodies that scientists really don't know what they do. For example, the appendix. It's not certain to scientists what the appendix does. It's a part of your body. Everyone has one. But scientists don't agree or don't know what it does. And sometimes people have pain caused by their appendix, and the doctor simply takes it out like an unnecessary car part, because some doctors say it doesn't do anything. It's not even necessary, but they're not certain. So even today, we still have parts of our bodies, and scientists are constantly studying to try and figure out things, because we don't have everything figured out. Some may like to act like we do, but we don't. We probably don't know a lot more than we do know. All right? So morphology is the study of the parts, and physiology is the study of the functions of the parts. And in biology, we refer to this as form and function. Form and function. Form is the study of the bodies themselves and their parts. Function is how they work. So for example, if we were to take one of the muscles on your arm, like your bicep, we first would study the form of the bicep. So we would look at the muscle itself. We'd ask, where does this muscle actually begin? And we'd find the place of origin where the muscle begins. And then we would follow the muscle and see where it attaches, where the muscle ends. And when we find the origin of the muscle and the spot where the muscle attaches to, I think it's called the insertion, we would then be able to study the muscle, study the size and shape of the muscle, compare it to other muscles, and so on. And then that would be morphology. Then we would study physiology. We'd try to understand what the muscle does. And you can think about it. If you flex your bicep muscle, you can see what it does. It causes, when that muscle contracts, it brings your forearm up towards your upper arm. That's what the bicep muscle does. We can study the form of the muscle and the function of the muscle. All right? So remember, morphology and physiology. Morphology and physiology. Form and function. Form and function. All right? Where are we at time-wise?
30 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, now as for experiments, how do we go about observations? How do we go about this? We can't just randomly observe things, right? So we have an idea of what we're looking for. We have an idea of what we're to look for, how we're to learn about the natural world, but we can't just go out and start randomly collecting information, right? We can't just go out into the natural world and start collecting information, because it would go on forever. And it would be chaotic and disorganized. And not only do we need information, but we need classified, organized, useful information. And so this pursuit of scientific knowledge is called experimentation, and there's a certain process to it. We follow steps to experiment or to seek information. So let's read about the experiment. In order to study physiology, and indeed most sciences, we have to make use of an experiment. We have to make use of an experiment. There are always 3 steps. So here's an important bit to note down in your notes. There are 3 steps. There are always 3 steps in a complete experiment. 3 steps. And beginners in scientific study, because it's like learning to ride a bike with training wheels. You're told how to do it, and you need to follow instructions carefully until you get some experience. Beginners should always try to follow these steps exactly. What's the first step of the experiment? The first step is actually making the experiment. That is, designing the experiment, thinking of the experiment that you'd like to conduct, and preparing everything that's necessary for the experiment. Actually making the experiment. The textbook says this includes collecting and putting together such materials as we may need, a statement of the work we perform, and most important of all, a definite statement of the problem that we're attempting to solve. So how do we go about seeking this scientific knowledge? We do so by means of experimentation, and there's a certain process. The first step is actually making the experiment. It starts with a problem. There's some problem we'd like to solve. We then have to think about how we might pursue the answer to that problem or that question. Then we have to prepare the experiment by which we're going to carry out the study, and then we have to actually carry out that study, carry out that experiment. So we go through that experiment, and then we come to the second step. The second step is to make observations on the experiment which we have set up. To make observations. And the textbook explains to us that these observations may extend over a period of time. So for example, let's say we wanted to see whether grass grew better with or without fertilizer. We could set up 2 different spots of grass. We could apply fertilizer to one spot and leave another spot without fertilizer, and then we could follow the progress and growth over 6 weeks. Okay, so an experiment may take time, and we have to record our observations. So we may say every morning at 8 o'clock a.m., we're going to take a picture of the 2 spots of grass. We're going to make notes as to what we see, and we're going to track the progress of this experiment over 6 weeks, making notes and observations every day as we go along. So the second step of the experiment is to make observations. And then it talks about noting, recording these observations. Whether it's in a notebook or, nowadays it'd be more likely on a computer, on a blog, on a website, in a typed up report. We have to record our observations. And then the third and final step, which the textbook says is the hardest step of all, the third step consists in drawing conclusions from the observations that we have made. Drawing conclusions. Every experiment should be illustrated with drawings to show all the apparatus used at each stage of the process. The lesson then talks about using a notebook. This was a big deal back when I was in school because we didn't have computers. We didn't necessarily have cameras at hand all the time. We had to rely more on taking notes, on making hand-drawn illustrations and things like that. So this may be a little bit dated, but still helpful if you'd like to use a notebook for this kind of thing. And then there's also a note on drawing. But this third step is drawing conclusions. And this is where science runs into trouble if you don't study reasoning at the same time. How do you draw conclusions when you've never studied the process of reasoning? Science depends on reasoning. The most difficult and most important step is drawing conclusions. That is reasoning. We can set up the experiment. We can make observations. But the third and the most difficult step is drawing conclusions. Who cares what the experiment shows us if we can't draw reasonable, valid conclusions from what we've observed? And many draw false conclusions or invalid conclusions from experiments. So science and experimentation is only as valuable as the conclusions that we can draw from it. Drawing the conclusions is the whole point. Now, a person who studies classical reasoning and learns the art of reasoning will be much more effective at drawing conclusions than a person who doesn't. And this is why when we look back in history, if we make a list of the greatest and most famous scientists who made the most amazing discoveries, who drew the most amazing conclusions, we'll find that they were men who studied reasoning, studied the classical liberal arts, and then took that knowledge of the arts with them into scientific experimentation and used that wisdom and skill to draw conclusions in the sciences. That's why I always tell people the best scientists will come from classical Catholic education. The best scientists will come from the classical liberal arts. Not because when we study the classical liberal arts, we reject natural science, but when we study natural science with the help of the classical liberal arts, it allows us to draw effective conclusions, to avoid false conclusions, and to move forward step by step without making errors. So the 3 steps of an experiment: making an experiment, recording observations, and drawing conclusions. Make sure you know those 3 steps. Now, this is something that's useful in science class or in a lab or whatever, but these are also things that are helpful in everyday life. This is helpful in everyday life. If you've got a problem and you'd like to find a solution to this problem, you can use this method of experimentation to solve your problems. Let's say you have a headache, okay? You have a headache. One option is that you can go to the doctor, right? You can go make a doctor's appointment and you can go tell your doctor, I have a headache. He can give you a prescription and you can just mindlessly take that prescription, take the pills, and hopefully the headache will be relieved. But if you keep getting headaches week after week after week, the doctor can continue prescribing you medication that allows you to avoid the pain of the head. But why are you getting headaches? There's a bigger problem. And so if you learn through the study of the natural sciences how to conduct an experiment, you can start seeking your own solution for your problem. How can you actually find the cause of this problem and try to avoid it? That's what classical medicine sought to do. Classical medicine didn't simply seek to relieve the symptoms or take the pain away. In classical medicine, the physician sought to figure out what was causing the problem and then prescribing the steps for how you can prevent or avoid the problem. And you can carry out that kind of experimentation yourself. You can keep records of when you get a headache, what the conditions are when you get a headache, what you've eaten when you get a headache, what time of the day.
Excuse me, Mr. Michael.
You can go on and on.
You are muted in your Zoom.
One moment.
I was trying to tell him that.
You can go on with the same problem, or you can start conducting your own experiment and learning how you can learn how or how the problem you're having is caused. Right? You can conduct your own experiment. So you see, this is not some special process that's used in science class. This is just basic problem solving that's applicable in any situation. You have a problem, propose an experiment. Conduct the experiment and make observations. Record the observations. And then when you've gathered the observations together, draw conclusions. It's simple problem solving applied to questions of natural science, of natural bodies, and so on. So, 3 steps to scientific experimentation. Make the experiment, record observations, and draw conclusions. And remember that your classical studies are not some kind of rebellion against scientific study. They're a means of helping you in scientific study. If you're interested in scientific studies, your classical studies can help you in those studies. All right? So those are the 3 steps of experimentation. I talked about the use of a notebook and drawing. Again, 50 years ago, drawing was much more important in research. Today, when you walk around with a camera that's got super cameras built into it, it's much easier and better to just snap photos and save records of your observations by photography than by drawing. There's then a section on the laboratory, and I'll just talk about this for a minute. I worked in a chemistry lab back when I was in college. The purpose of a laboratory is to control the environment. One of the problems, if we try to conduct an experiment outside, there are 1,000 different things that can change, right? One day it can be hot, one day it can be cold. One day it can be windy, one day it can be sunny, one day it can be cloudy. It can rain one day. There's animals moving around that can change things. There's all kinds of variables, they're called, that can change day by day. If we want to conduct an experiment, we can't have 5,000 different changing variables. You understand that? If we want to know what causes the tomatoes to grow better, we can't have 1,000 different changing variables. We have to be able to isolate causes of things. And the purpose of a laboratory is to create an environment where we can control the variables. We can limit how many things can change. So we can concentrate on one specific cause and test whether it actually is the cause of a certain result or observation. Do you understand that? We try to control the environment. We can control the temperature. We can control the humidity. We can control lighting. All these different factors in a laboratory can be controlled. So we can conduct an experiment, we can carry out a test and know that only one thing changed. Only one thing changed. And we can observe the effects of that one change. The other purpose of a laboratory is to just keep all of the supplies and resources that we need for scientific experimentation in one place. Okay, so the main benefit of a laboratory is that in scientific experimentation, we need to limit and control variables. Do you know what a variable is? It's any circumstance that can change that might affect the outcome of our experiment. We have to limit the variables. We can't do that outside. Okay? In a laboratory, we can control variables. We can focus on specific changes. We can test things individually. We can isolate causes of effects. That's one of the benefits of a laboratory. The other is just the convenience of it. It's comfortable. It's reliable day by day. You can work over a long period of time. You don't have to go through seasons outside and so on. So there's a section on a laboratory or experiment notebook, on drawing, on the laboratory, and then a section that talks about the essential interest in laboratory work. But what this really has to do with is, if you're interested in the sciences, if you're interested in the natural sciences, you have to be willing to conduct experiments. And it can be very slow, boring, difficult work. You can't just rush to conclusions. You can't make oversimplified conclusions. You have to carry out the experiments. You have to limit and isolate variables and identify real causes of things and be able to prove that this or that is the cause of this or that effect. Do you understand that idea? To prove that this caused this. That's difficult work. Just like in reasoning, it's difficult to prove something in reasoning. It's also difficult to prove something in science. To prove something. Right? For example, if I go outside and I spray some fertilizer on one section of the lawn, and that lawn grows better than the other sections, does that prove that fertilizer makes grass grow better? No, it doesn't. Because it could have been the fertilizer combined with something else that happened. You see what I mean? And not the fertilizer itself. So the solution may be more complicated. And that real work of scientific experimentation and drawing conclusions is very difficult work. And that's why this textbook concludes this lesson by saying that if you're interested in the work of the natural sciences, real natural sciences, you have to be interested in the work of the laboratory, because that's where that work is conducted. In experimentation, if you follow the work of real scientists, they may work for decades, running experiments, adjusting experiments, and may never find a solution for years and years and years, and just continue carrying out their observations, recording their observations, attempting to draw conclusions. And you know what? They may never solve the problem, but they may leave to the next generation all of their observations, which might be helpful. So that work of experimentation, it's not necessarily exciting work. It's difficult work, it's painstaking work, but that's the real work of the natural sciences. Like I said, when I was in college, I worked in a chemistry lab, and I can tell you, it is not fun work. That was one of the experiences that convinced me that I wasn't interested in science and medicine. I was not interested in the work of the laboratory. All right? So that's, I believe, the end of chapter 1 and our first lesson in biology. Let me just scroll down here and make sure. Yeah, that's the end of chapter 1. So to wrap up this first chapter, where are we at with time?
53 minutes.
53, good. Okay, so to wrap up this first lesson, this first chapter, we spent 2 class meetings on chapter 1. We had a general introduction to the study of biology, and we went through all of the content of the chapter. The most important things that I want you to remember from this chapter that we're going to talk about and try to keep in mind as we work through this whole study. Natural sciences are study of physical, observable realities. It's not philosophy. It's not religion. We don't believe in science. We don't propose ideas and then accept them without proof, without demonstration. You'll hear people in modern society talk about how they believe in science. That makes no sense. Science is about observation and demonstration. That's what makes science difficult. We learned about morphology, the study of the forms of physical bodies, living bodies, and of physiology, the study of functions of living bodies. And we learn the 3 steps of experimentation, right? How an experiment is actually carried out. By making an experiment where we ask a question or we propose a problem, and then we think about how we might seek a solution to that problem, and then carry out an experiment by which we seek a solution. Recording observations. The more detailed the observations can get, the better. That's why today computers help so much with scientific experimentation, because computers, you can set up computers to record observations every single second for 20 years. Something that humans could never do. Computers can help with experimentation. That's why they're used in science, right? But recording observations is the second part of experimentation. And then third, after the experiment's been conducted, after all the observations have been collected, taking all of that information and then reflecting on it and drawing conclusions. That's the most difficult and really the most important step in experimentation. If we don't do that, we're just gathering information for no purpose. So 3 steps of scientific experimentation, and then the last thing we talked about was the real work of science. The real work of science is conducting experiments and working to draw true conclusions from our experiments. And I explained how classical studies helps us with that. We don't pursue classical studies and reject scientific studies. We understand that scientific studies are only useful for certain subjects. And our classical studies, like the study of reasoning most importantly, can help us in the work of experimentation, in drawing conclusions. Okay? So that's all for chapter 1 in modern biology. 2 class lessons, lots of introductory information, but that's everything for our first chapter, our first lesson in modern biology.